All right, I am joined today by Adam, and you are the creator of Hyperview. Is that accurate? And co-author of Hypermedia Systems, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for taking the time. And it's Stepinski is the last name, right? Is that pronounced correctly?
Correct.
Excellent. Yeah, so thank you for joining. I've been actually trying to reach out to you for a few months now. um, I couldn't message the Hyperview Twitter account, and then I don't know, I just couldn't find you. So I appreciate Carson Gross getting us in touch.
Yes. Yeah, I'm quite bad at Twitter, but I think the best way for Hyperview questions, we're always monitoring GitHub.
GitHub,
There's
okay.
a Reddit, there's a subreddit someone created as well, and um, yeah, we're on the Discord server for HTMX.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I haven't, I created a Reddit user and stuff, but I haven't got into Discord, and I just go on the Reddit like every couple of months just to
Yeah.
like see, but I'm just not, Twitter's new for me too. So I'm kind of trying to
Yeah.
like dip my toe into this world.
Yeah, hopefully, we have some younger engineers on the team now, so hopefully I can get one of them more interested in social media since it's not
Nice.
my forte.
All right. All right. Get the Hyperview account going.
That's right.
Nice.
Yeah, memes are not my strength like they are for Carson.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so I'll just say my understanding of Hyperview, and I have read not the whole part of the book that had to do with it, because I kind of like tend to not absorb information unless I'm actively working on something that is related to
Hmm.
it. But so my understanding of Hyperview is sort of taking this concept of, a hypermedia approach to the mobile world, where you are trying to build something that is set up for server first development, but in a native, mobile app. So just so that you have, it's not just a fake website on the phone, right? Is this sort of the big picture of Hyperview?
That's right. Yeah. So, if you think about hypermedia on the web, there's two components. There's the format, HTML, right? That's kind of a standardized stuff. And then there's the clients, the various web browsers, Chrome, Firefox, or whatever you prefer. And so to create a hypermedia system for mobile, there's no kind of equivalent to, the hypermedia format that is native to mobile in terms of understanding the types of interactions and ways that people would like to build apps. And there's also no client equivalent to consume that format. So Hyperview as a project, I really think of it as two parts. We've defined a spec of a format based on XML that we think does a good job expressing the UI and interactions that users expect on mobile apps. And we've also created a client that's built on top of React Native and can be, used to build cross-platform apps for Android and iOS and distributed through the stores, the Google Play Store and Apple App Store.
Nice, nice. I'll just say one thing before I
Hmm.
ask any more questions. I was watching your talk, which you Carson posted, but I think you at the University of Montana. You talked there a little bit about Hyperview, and I had to stop it like halfway through, because for a couple of years, I have been, I had to build a mobile app for my company,
Hmm.
and I just wanted something simple. And I was like, okay, I want to figure out how to do this, and starting from scratch. And I use Flutter, which is kind of a
Hmm.
similar, like maybe to React Native sort of setup, where you kind of, the concept is that you build it once in Flutter and you can kind of export it to anywhere. So that
Right,
was
right.
appealing
Hmm.
to me. And I started building it, and it was just like a nightmare. And I was like, I'm not going to finish this. I'm gonna, if I ever have to make a change, which I do all the time as a web developer, I like to
Hmm.
have these quick changes. And I started to realize all the problems with iOS, with building this. And like I was have to submit it to Apple every change, like 4 days from now, I'll get a response. Anyway, my sort of like revelation while doing that was to build a bunch of reusable components in Flutter and then have my server tell it what to draw, what data to use, all this kind of stuff. So I have been building for myself this like I didn't know what it was at the time, but I was
Yeah,
listening to your hyperview and I was like, oh, God, like I don't want to be influenced too much by this talk, by what you're talking about, because it's like similar to what I'm building. So like
yeah.
how did
Mhm.
you come up, like what was your sort of are you like a web developer by trade, or how did you sort of come to building this?
Yeah, I would call myself a full stack engineer. And for the last half of my career, of about 15 years, I've been more actually uh, also working as a manager and leader of software teams. And over that career, I pretty much always have managed teams that built mobile applications. Um, and that started early on when the best practice was you have your separate set of team, your separate team for Android development. They work on the Android app, and then another team for iOS. And then maybe you have a team that works on the back end and creates the APIs for both of these. And that definitely has its pros and cons. You need a lot of engineers to ship a product. You end
Yeah.
up kind of with a fragmented experience, which is more of a problem for maybe the company than the users. But the iOS and Android apps are different. That can be very hard to manage internally because now maybe they require different APIs and that requires extra work and so on. So, I think I was pretty early to embrace later on uh, React Native as a cross-platform solution that not only meant that um, we could have one team creating the mobile app that ran for both iOS and Android, but we could also leverage, the pretty widespread knowledge of React. And you can, if you're comfortable with React, you can pick up React Native pretty easily. So that kind
Yeah.
of opened the possibility for more of a full stack development approach on mobile as well. Um, and then, once we're using React Native and, you know, talking to kind of APIs that return JSON, that's then when I started making the connection like, wait a sec, this is essentially the same as like spas on the web. And, I'm not going to preach to the choir here, right? Since people listening to this already, I think, understand some of the benefits of hypermedia and are probably at least interested in using HTMX. Went on that same journey. So I started using Intercooler, the predecessor to HTMX on the web. I said, well, this is so much better. Right? We have, server control here. Um, our front end is a lot simpler. We're not maintaining these APIs. Why can't we have that for our mobile apps as well? And I would even posit that the problem with spas on the web, it's actually a lot worse in the mobile ecosystem because of the nature of distribution, right? Like if you're
Yeah.
writing a spa on the web, you can deploy your backend and front end sort of at the same time, right? Like, so if you need to
Yeah.
change the front end and change the APIs, you can release that at the same time. So your users can be using the new API with the new front end. But
Yeah.
on
You
mobile,
can break
because
your
the apps,
caches and stuff.
yeah. But on mobile, your apps you don't control the distribution, right? You have to go through these app stores, which means you have multiple versions of your app out there. You can't control, what version of the app is running on users' devices. Like maybe you can force them to upgrade and things, but
Sort
Apple
of, right?
controls the rollout, right? And we've seen in our own metrics, there's a long tail of people on various versions of the app. And those versions of the app, because the logic of interacting with the API is bundled in there, if you don't want to break those, you have to maintain a backwards compatible API or version your API and maintain it for a long time. And that was the situation we were in. Perhaps we would ship a version of our app that had some kind of bug in it, and we would try to hack around that by modifying the API, but only for that version. And then when we released a new version of the app. We needed a new API for it. So I think the problems of like kind of the SPA uh, architecture were actually, we felt more pain with using that on mobile than we did on web, which is how I started thinking like, well, how do we bring hypermedia to our approach for mobile app development?
Yeah, I mean, I cannot imagine living in that space for a long time, where you have a bunch of apps, like in the way that I have a bunch of web apps out there right now that I am responsible
Hmm.
for, that I maintain. If I had, if working with the existing ecosystem, and if I was building in Swift, or whatever, some even Flutter or like whatever it is, if you're not using a hypermedia approach, like it
Yeah.
just feels like it's everything's cumulative. Like everything you
Hmm.
do, now you have to support every step along the way. And it's like, and you have to, the feedback loop is so long.
Yeah.
So I mean, I just like I don't. I was looking. I was feel like I was facing that when I was building my app, and I think it's like I don't know how you don't come to that. Not that like everyone
Yeah.
should do that, but it's like
And
that's what else can you do? Like just live with that.
yeah, and it's funny. I think in the industry, you see basically anyone maintaining a large number of apps or a very large complex app kind of coming to the same conclusion. Like if you look at the engineering blogs for Airbnb, DoorDash, Uber, they all have a post where they talk about their mobile apps and this architecture that they developed. They call it like server-driven UI. They don't call it
Oh,
hypermedia
really?
because I think they haven't conceived of it in that way. But essentially, everyone is doing this idea that you
Oh,
talked
no
about, you
shit.
kind of found on your own of like, oh, how do I have my server control which UI elements are showing? I'm biased, but I think Hyperview is a better approach than what these other companies are doing because they've tended to tie their server-driven UI frameworks very tightly coupled um, to their server architecture and to their kind of networking architecture. Whereas
Yep.
Hyperview, I think, because I kind of had this idea from HTMX and intercooler first, like I always thought of it as a hypermedia approach. And therefore, we're kind of agnostic to the backend. You can use any backend technology as long as you can render an XML response.
Yep.
And because we've kind of standardized on a spec that uses XML and is extensible, um, I think it's a format. Like if someone wanted to use Flutter to create a Hyperview client, there's nothing stopping them. And, that would probably actually have some benefits over the client that we provide on GitHub right now.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Huh. So how do you like when it comes into your app, so you've got a
Mhm.
React Native setup. So I mean, I'll just say the sort of setup that I have in Flutter, and maybe
Mhm.
is this somewhat similar? You've basically built a bunch of components inside using React Native, and so you've got kind of a list of these components that can be mixed and matched, and then they match with your XML. You give an XML tag that matches the name of the component or something along those lines. Does that sound about right? And then each one has a set of attributes that you can add.
Correct. Yeah. So what happens when you launch an app written in Hyperview? To the very minimal amount of effort you need to do to create a app built with Hyperview is download our client and change one configuration of the URL, which is the entry point of the app. Like think of this as like, the first URL you enter to open a web app. This has to be kind of like hard coded into our app for distribution. So once you
Yep.
do that, you configure that, and then you basically say when you open the app, launch Hyperview with this URL. The Hyperview client will make that HTTP request, get that XML, and then it parses that XML into a DOM and just starts traversing it. And we have a registry where each tag name corresponds to a React Native component. So essentially, we're creating, the tree of React Native components dynamically based on what's specified in the XML. And those React Native components will get a prop passed to it, which is the element. And from there, you can look at the XML attributes or even the children if needed, or you can delegate rendering back to Hyperview for the children. So in this way, yes, we kind of ship the core library with the most basic components that we think someone would need um, to render a mobile UI. And yeah, then it's just kind of walking the XML doc, parsing it, mapping to React Native components, and then rendering those to screen.
Yep. No, I mean that makes that makes a lot of sense, and it's funny because what I found kind of working on a similar project is that you the data map that you get using, in your case, XML, in my case, a sort of version of HTML.
Hmm.
It's basically HTML. I just have the names of the components are the tags,
Hmm.
which is maybe almost exactly what the XML setup is.
Hmm.
But it's like that mental map. It's not just because I know HTML and I like HTML. It actually works for almost everything. It's hierarchical. You start at the
Yeah.
top, you
Hmm.
have a page, and like I kind of was like, well, I don't know if this setup's going to work. And it's like, it does work, right? I mean, it's
Hmm.
like what can't be described in that format on a mobile app? Have you found anything yet? Like,
Well, I think the key is extensibility. So, I often get a question about usage of XML. Some people think that's kind of old-fashioned. Why not using JSON to represent this? Um, but I think you're right. Like, I think XML, and in fact, I wrote an article, a blog post about this, about why I think XML is a more natural way to express UIs in general, kind of like the nested tree nature of it and kind of a clean separation between elements with attributes versus like a parent-child relationship is
yeah,
a more natural way. JSON does not have that built in, so you end up having to define a spec on top of JSON to represent that. So that's one reason why I think XML, HTML are kind of great universal ways of describing UIs. But the one thing that I ended up embracing in XML that I sort of discovered while writing Hyperview is the X in XML, extensibility, right? So XML
hmm,
has this concept of namespaces. So you can define a namespace with a URL, and then within that namespace, you can have your own elements or attributes. And to me, once I realized this, I said, okay, well, we have to build in extensibility into the Hyperview client because mobile UIs can be quite complex and require quite a bit of interaction or kind of detailed work to have the experience that users expect. And there's no way that the core Hyperview library can cover all of those use cases. But if we make it extensible, then anyone can kind of add their own elements to describe some of the more unique or complex elements that they want to use within their mobile apps. And I think that ended up being a real game changer for us and something that at the companies that use Hyperview, like I know pretty much everyone ends up creating some of these custom elements and custom behaviors. And I think it really sort of extends the sort of quality of UIs and experiences you can deliver while still kind of fully embracing hypermedia and kind of like this declarative syntax in the XML. And I'm happy to talk more about that. I think that's something, I wish I had more time to go into in the lecture that I just did at Montana State University, but I
yeah.
think there's a lot of power there. And in some ways, we've been able to, I think, more cleanly capture some of the ideas that on the web people are trying to do with web components, or like in HTMX, various plugins and scriptability that has to inevitably find its way into kind of the declarative syntax.
So like when you say extensible, are people, this is just sort of the way I'm imagining it, like they
Mm-hmm.
would, they'd have your basic entry point app in the whatever their programming language that, whatever system they have to use the React Native setup. Um, and would they write their own React Native component and then they would give it a name that then would be referenced by the XML, just like all the other components that are part of the
Exactly.
library?
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, there's nothing special about the components of like, basic text and labels and inputs. Those ship with the core Hyperview library. There's nothing really special about them, right? Again, we register a namespace and an element name. And when we're parsing the XML, if we encounter that namespace and element name, we render that React Native component. So anyone
Right.
is free to create their own React Native component and register it with the system as well. And then if the XML parser encounters that, it will map to the custom React Native component that's been added. And I know like a lot of people in the hypermedia community now, they don't want to sort of touch JavaScript at all. So I feel like I should stress you don't have to use this, out of the box. If you just set up the Hyperview client, you can do everything you need and have a mobile app with multiple screens and forms and all of this, and you can feel very comfortable just writing XML on the back end. But if and when you're ready to take it to the next level, you don't have to abandon Hypermedia on mobile. You can just extend Hyperview client. And some ways of thinking about it that I like to tell people is like, well, your app is sort of like your own um, browser, right? And like, what if you didn't have to worry about the like, web standards body and you could go and like extend the browser in any way you wanted? This is kind of the power that you can have with the Hyperview client. Feel free to add any experimental tags or new interactions and things that make sense for your app because you don't have to create a universal browser. You don't have to consider all those cases. You can really customize it just for your use case, which helps it kind of stay declarative and avoid kind of hacks that sometimes need to be added through scripting.
Yeah, and like that's not even mentioning like all the power you can tap into, like the fact that it's a phone. I mean, you've got like
That's right.
accelerometers and location and camera and I mean
Hmm.
just like a wealth of these sort of things that as web developers, just not part of the experience most of the time.
That's right. Yeah. And so the company I'm at right now, InstaWork, this is where we created Hyperview. And yeah, we need access to a lot of those things. So we have integration with cameras, photo libraries. We do a lot of things with geolocation. So users can give us permission to get their location, right? And based on that, on the back end, we do various things. And we support all of those things with Hyperview and Hypermedia and just writing some of these extensions. So um, in order to tap into all that power, developers are still just writing XML. Yes, there's a little bit of JavaScript we write up front to create these components and behaviors, but once they are there, it can be used anywhere in the app just by dropping in a tag in the XML.
Yeah. So this, I mean, you said you work at InstaWork. So is the what's the primary app that you sort of developed Hyperview for? And like, I guess I think the big question that I had, and that
Hmm.
probably people listening is like, what sort of apps are you building with it? Can you
Hmm.
build? Do you see any limitations of the approach or of the
Hmm.
the actual limitations of
Yeah.
this?
Hmm.
But mainly, like, what
Yeah.
what are some apps you're building? I guess is the first part of that.
Sure. So yeah, InstaWork is a staffing marketplace app. So we have apps where people are looking for sort of temporary, short-term jobs, um, physical jobs. So they have to like, go to a work site to do it. So you can think of like a warehouse or a hotel or something like that.
Yep.
So our main app is InstaWork for professionals, which lets them sign up, kind of upload their experience and credentials, and based on that, they can get approved to work various positions in their local area. And in the app, they will see, okay, what are the various jobs or shifts available to me? If there's something that matches my skills, I can book it. I get all the details about where the shift is happening, when do I have to go there, clock in, clock out, get paid. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And we have also an app for the business side to actually post these shifts and make them available.
Yep.
So the first thing I'll say about this app is in a marketplace app, it's very important that everyone is kind of getting the same experience and getting the same data. Because if we launch a feature, for example, I'm just making this up, but if we launch a feature that um, is doing a promotion and giving people a $50 bonus if they work on a certain day, well, if you have a version of the app that doesn't know that we're doing this bonus, you're at a disadvantage, right? And someone who has a version of the app where we've coded in the bonus, they're going to be more motivated to work, but that can create imbalances in the marketplace or lower the efficiency. Hypermedia
Yep.
is great for that because uh, we're doing the bonus. Okay, we code it on the back end. We start showing the bonus everywhere. Everyone gets that same data, is on the same playing field. So for a marketplace, it really helps us with the efficiency of the product we're building and making sure that no one is kind of disadvantaged based on being on an older version. So I think apps where people are connecting and it's important for them to have the same experience. We found, that the hypermedia approach is really good for that. The other thing
Yep.
about this app that I'll say is that, the core service we're providing is matching professionals with local businesses. So it's really the core logic is on the back end, and the app is useless without the internet because you can't
Yeah.
get, you won't get the list of jobs that people are posting live if you don't have an internet connection. So for us, it's an assumption that the app only works when you have a network connection. Um, if someone is building an app that is primarily offline or doesn't even need a network connection because all of your data is kind of local to you, then this approach probably doesn't make sense. And I would
Yep.
probably advise someone like that to still kind of, create an experience, yeah, where, you're just using kind of the native frameworks, or even you can use React Native with the local storage. But um, in our case, I think Hypermedia is a great fit because of sort of the aspect of connecting different users together. They need to kind of have shared state and a shared experience, and the fact that it's kind of always online.
Yeah. Yep. No, that makes sense. And so that's your, the primary one. It sounds like there's a couple different apps. You have like different versions. You're probably all hitting the same database, but you've got different
Yeah,
apps for different versions of clients, which I think makes perfect sense.
yeah, yeah. For people, yeah, like the business side, if they're the ones posting shifts and seeing, okay, who's coming to like fill my shift, that's a different experience that they need than someone who's browsing or looking at a map and trying to find shifts that they want to work. So we have two different apps for that, but they are both pretty much now 100% converted to Hyperview. And one interesting thing we've talked about is now that these are both kind of completely Hyperview apps driven from the server, um, both of our apps are pretty much just shells, right? There's absolutely
Yeah,
no logic in
exactly.
it. We could combine them, right? Or there could be a switch in the app that says, okay, now show me
Oh,
the
funny.
business interface, and we just change the entry point URL, and all of a
Based on the
sudden you
user.
have
Yep.
the full other app. Yeah. Because we sometimes get issues if someone downloads the wrong app, or something like that. So we haven't really gone that path, but it is an interesting thing that we could essentially combine these two things, and splitting them off is almost more of a marketing decision than an engineering one.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you, and like, feel free to not answer this question if you don't want to. But like, do
Hmm.
you, do you think there's any, is it against the spirit of the app approval and store and
Hmm.
all this stuff to, because and this, the stuff that I'm working on right now, my vision for
Hmm.
it is literally you put one line of code and that's your app. And it's just what you
Yeah.
said.
Hmm.
You just point it to somewhere and then that's
Yeah.
handling everything. And so, you know, in terms of the Apple Store, it's like, what are they
Hmm.
really reviewing? Like, I could
Yeah.
change, so maybe this is not, it's just something I've been thinking about. Like, do they have a
Yeah. This
problem with
question
this?
comes
Have you
up quite
seen
a lot.
this?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So a couple things I'll say about that. I think first, there's a lot of apps in both app stores that already kind of work like this, right? Like any app which is a wrapper around a web view, like a Cordova app or something, right? Um, it's the same sort of thing, and there's a ton of apps like that out there.
So Electron or
Um,
something, is that one of the ones that does that? Is that, or maybe
yeah,
I'm,
yeah.
maybe, okay, yeah.
So yeah, basically, there's a lot of apps like that. Instawork with Hyperview has been out there for a long time as well. And then I mentioned before, all these companies, the biggest apps out there, Uber, DoorDash, Airbnb, they're all doing server-driven UI as well. From Apple's perspective, when they're reviewing the app, of course, someone is looking at the UI, but let's say they have a proxy. Well, they're just seeing, an app making API requests. In our case, it's XML. In other cases, it's JSON. But ultimately, it's just data that's coming across the network.
Yep.
What they're interested in preventing is kind of shipping executable code, right? Because they're worried, I think, about apps breaking out of a sandbox or things like that, right? So what they don't want
Interesting.
you to do is sort of like ship code that accesses system APIs in a way that they're not aware of through static analysis. But in the case of Hyperview based app, right? Like if we have created a custom component that, for example, needs access to the camera, that is in the binary that Apple is reviewing, right? And their static analysis will show they're kind of requesting this entitlement. Um, there's some code here which is accessing the camera. There's nothing that, if we didn't have that in the initial version, we can't push some XML that all of a sudden enables camera access. So from that
Interesting.
perspective, from the security perspective, yeah, we're not kind of shipping code that gets compiled and can access SDKs or APIs that Apple's not aware of. And then from the perspective of kind of what you said, where, hey, someone could do an App Store review and then when their app gets approved and the end user's hand, completely switch the UI. And the cat's out of the bag on that, right? Like I said, if anyone's doing server-driven
Yeah.
design, they can do that. And in fact, over the years, we've seen Apple's policies change from being enforced through technology to enforced now in spirit. So I think their rules have changed a little bit from kind of saying you can use this tech and not this tech. And I think they've realized, well, anyone can like call an API and activate a different path in their code. So it's not really about the tech, it's about the spirit of you shouldn't do a bait and switch app where you show
Well,
us one thing and then do something else.
and
It's
they
it's
may have
harder for
some
them
way
to,
of
yeah.
finding that maybe that we are not
I
even aware
yeah, I
of.
think it's much harder for them to enforce, but they probably rely on user reports and yeah, I don't know how they do it, but yeah, that's kind of been my take on the situation.
Yeah. So if you were to, if someone builds an app with Hyperview and
Hmm.
they never touch the camera, they're the way they're building their app, they're never going to use the camera component, but they may
Hmm.
have to like because the Hyperview library has somewhere in it the potential to use the camera. Um, you may have to sign on the iOS sort of like what does your app do? You'd have to sort of say all the things that Hyperview does. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. So our approach has been that the client is a very small core, right? And we're trying to not include kind of features that, yeah, require some of these like special permissions or
Yeah.
entitlements, right? So like the core Hyperview client, it mostly can do, you know, render text, show screens, modals, uh, form inputs, that kind of stuff. And of course, everything can be styled to look as you want. And then, we use the extension so that you only have to include something that accesses the camera if your app needs it. One kind of recent development that I would love to talk a little bit more about is we've always kind of touted this extensibility, but I think a lot of developers coming to Hyperview um, may not want to like necessarily write that code themselves because in some ways they're attracted to hypermedia because they don't like React or React Native. And internally at Instawork, we've written dozens and dozens of these kind of components, and we realized we can start sort of giving them back to the community. So very
Oh,
recent
interesting.
efforts we've started. open sourcing not just the core client, but now some of these we've added a section in our repository for like community contributions, and the first half dozen or so components that we've done there have been pulled out of our Instawork app and shared to the community. And hopefully that makes it easier, more plugin like way where someone can say, hey, I want to show a Google map that I can drag and pinch in my mobile app. Well, Instawork has done that. You don't have to write that yourself and figure out React Native. Just, import, download this from NPN, import it, register it, and now, here's the XML syntax you can use to show a map at the specific coordinate. So that's a recent development that I'm excited, hoping to see contributions from the community as well, because I know there's a lot of developers out there who've written components that I think could be shared and reused and appreciated by everyone else.
Yeah, I mean that's awesome. I think that's like, I mean that's a really cool way to do it. And I don't know, like I'm kind of like I'm curious, like what was the decision like to open source Hyperview for you? Like, is this one of your, is this, have you done open source projects before, or is someone else involved? I don't know. Was it developed with sort of the team and then you lead the team? So you made the decision. How did that sort of play out?
Yeah, I had never done like a large open source project like this before, and I'm certainly not the expert. I'm learning. I think we saw that this technology was really powerful and applicable to a lot of other developers and companies, not just Instawork. So I think our general philosophy is like, look, if we've developed a technology that is not kind of like a trade secret for us, but we think is beneficial, then we should share it back. And it's only fair because we rely on so much open source technology to develop things, so like I feel like we need to be good citizens and not only contribute to open source projects, but open source things that we built ourselves. So that was kind of the initial sort of take. And I thought, maybe as someone who's a manager, I'm always looking at ways to get an edge in the hiring market and kind of build a brand for our engineering team. So I kind of said, maybe this is a good way to, just make a stamp and like, get our name out there as like an engineering team that is doing something new and interesting. I should mention all of this was happening before HTMX was out. So this was still when
Oh, really?
intercooler was there, right?
Oh, yeah.
So
Okay.
the the best decision I made, was to reach out and engage with Carson early on when we were. I think Instawork had the largest, and probably still has the largest app built on intercooler in terms of number of attributes and kind of pages that use it. So I had
Oh,
kind of reached out
interesting.
to him because I was so interested in it. And when I started developing Hyperview, I shared it with him, and he was very much encouraging me to go down that path. So the best decision I made is when he decided to release HTMX and kind of break the jQuery dependency, and that took off. I kind of see myself as riding his coattails in the wave of excitement and adoption of HTMX and uh, bringing attention to Hyperview as well through that. So um, yeah, I think I have a lot to learn from him and other projects around uh, nurturing an open source project. It's been mostly organic. We're just trying to ship and improve the code, engage the community some more. But as you can see from our Twitter account, I think we could use some help in some of these areas that we've underinvested in.
Well, I mean, I would say, I mean, it's an amazing project, and I just the vision for it, so before I kind of, I'd been looking into Hyperview. So, like I said,
Mhm.
I've been building my own thing that I'm now realizing it's like you probably have done all of it and in a more complete way than what I'm working on. But I think I'm too deep into to switch gears now. I'm going to go
Mhm.
forward with my thing, but it's still like, uh, you know, this concept of building it like this and then also offering, like community driven plugins and having it be open source. And it's just kind of, it's ambitious and just kind of a very cool project. Um, so I don't, I'm just, I'm impressed. It's the way it's coming together. It sounds really cool. And
Thank you. Yeah.
I wish that I had, my from my own purposes, I was considering kind of like, should I give this a shot with my own thing? But one of the barriers for me was the React Native, and not because I have anything against React. I mean, I don't know it. I've never
Yeah.
sort of compiled anything in it, and I had used Flutter back in 2019, and I'd built that app, and I'd used sort of the
Mhm.
the nascent version of a hypermedia approach,
Yeah.
which I
Hmm.
sort of thought was like my big revelation while building the app, but I guess is getting more and more common.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like I think this is something. It sounds like there's not as many. You don't have to worry that much that you won't be able to do things, as I was sort of concerned about when I first started looking at Hyperview.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends. I don't know the exact kind of app that you're building, but this it's the same as like, if you're using HTMX on the web, some things will be a lot easier. Um, some things will be a lot harder, right? And like even I think Carson would say like sometimes it is appropriate to use, a lot of JavaScript on the client, right? And but you don't also have to like pick and choose and like only use one sort of technology. What I would maybe suggest for yourself, since it seems like you're pretty deep into Flutter and developing things that way, but I think maybe you could even take inspiration just from like the spec in Hyperview for like, using XML, kind of creating this registry of components to render things. I just think it's a great, like, kind of more universal way of expressing UIs from the server. And yeah, React Native is the client we shipped, but I sort of I can see Hyperview developing a little bit like the Markdown project. I don't know if you're a Markdown user or if you're aware of that.
Uh, I mean, I have used
Hmm.
Markdown just as like
Yeah,
a, just
yeah,
for a few times, but I will say I don't
hmm,
use it regularly.
yeah. But I think the key why I mentioned Markdown is this was a project John Gruber released, and he also essentially created the spec for Markdown and the reference implementation in Perl. But he's very much sort of said this is what it is. He's let people sort of take it and evolve the syntax. So you end up with like GitHub has their own like GitHub flavored Markdown, and of
Right.
course probably no one's using that original Perl implementation of converting it to HTML. People have written their own sort of implementations and every programming language out there. And I think, to me, I see a lot of analogies to Hyperview. Like we've created the spec, it's meant to be extended, used, like I encourage people to extend it and make it their own, right? For their use case. I think that's
Right.
one of, one of the powerful things in it that you don't have to file an issue and wait for us to like have time to add your feature. You can go ahead and add it yourself and then maybe contribute it back to the community. Likewise, we're not tied to a specific client. So like if you just like these ideas for how we think about structuring UI and behaviors, the interactions, we haven't really talked about that, but um, yeah, like feel free to be inspired by those and take them, and like don't use React Native if you don't like it or you're not familiar with it. So I think I'm totally happy to see people embrace the ideas, even if they're not necessarily downloading and using our code.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like, yeah, you've got I think it's a very sharing, open source kind of attitude about the project, which is cool. And yeah, so how do you like, I'll just say more about my thing because it's on my head, it's on my mind, but I've kind of embraced taking some of the tailwind kind of approach to 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 doing UI stuff in Flutter. So I've kind of developed I'm not trying to recreate Tailwind, but some of the basic ideas of like these are basically classes. I don't call them classes, call them styles, but you add on to each component, and every component has is wrapped in a style container that sort of allows you to that's your styling container. When you add classes, that's what gets the style. So does that sort of sound kind of what you guys are thinking for what Hyperview sort of does for UI? How do you guys sort of handle that? I don't really know how React Native handles it, so it's a little
You're
hard for
talking
me to.
about styling, like specifically?
Yeah, I mean, like
Hmm.
text color, padding, margin,
Yeah.
like all these things that would just sort of be part of any UI,
Yeah.
borders,
Hmm.
background, all that stuff.
Right. So Hyperview in this case, like we pretty much took what React Native offered in terms of styling and mapped it one to one to
Okay.
XML syntax. So unlike on the web, you have HTML and then CSS. CSS is a different format. In our case, we just have everything in XML, including the styles. So, you just define a style tag. And it's a little less powerful than CSS, but I think in a way that makes the right trade-offs for styling an application versus CSS HTML, which, has its origins more in like a document layout and formatting.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Hyperview mostly just maps to what React Native offers. And what React Native offers is, I think, inspired by styling in CSS. For example, in React Native, all layouts are sort of done using the Flexbox paradigm.
Yep.
So that's what we expose as well. And that works pretty well. But again, yeah, all the kind of styling around colors and things like that. Um, yeah, it's supported in Hyperview in the XML syntax. You define your styles by ID, and then you can reference those on the elements that you're rendering, and those styles would get applied there. Um,
Yep.
I think we've taken like a pretty low level approach. Um, and it's what I've seen some other companies do is, um, there's this notion of like design systems, right? Like where I'm just going to build my app with, I've already defined that, there's three sizes of buttons, right? And they can be these
Yeah.
colors and things like that. So you could do that with Hyperview. You could ignore all of the sort of low level styling we have and just sort of create your own custom components that maybe they wrap the text component that Hyperview provides, and it builds in some attributes for doing different sizes and things like that. So I've seen some companies go that route. You lose some flexibility in how you do the styling, but you don't have to like be writing the style rules each time. Your XML can be a little more concise. So yeah, I think there's different approaches, and the syntax and client is flexible enough to support both.
Yeah, and so you do feel like you've sort of tried to tap in as much as possible into the React Native. So like if React Native were to add something, is it almost like does Hyperview sort of hard code everything from React Native, or is it almost like it could um is it dynamic, I guess is what I'm saying, or is it sort of you have to keep up with what React Native is doing, or is it almost like you can, if there's a new React Native thing, now you can access it in the attributes?
We have a layer in between, so we try to like only explicitly expose the things that make sense.
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't. And I always keep in my head like a little bit of this trade-off. I don't want us to be too tied to React Native. So if there's something that I feel is like a little too specific to how React Native does things, we may not want to expose that because, I would love for someone to create a Flutter version, or something like that. And if we're like too tied to React Native, that makes it a little bit harder. So yeah, anytime React Native has a new version, they release some new styling controls. We consider each one, or someone on GitHub will write an issue saying, hey, can you expose this? And we'll think about it. We say, is this kind of universal enough? Could this be done in other frameworks? And if so, we will expose it. And sometimes the mapping is not entirely one-to-one. We will, um, you know, try to like create an abstraction that we think would be, easier it can support the feature in React Native, but it would also be more universal to re-implement in a different framework.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, just one like big picture thing about
Hmm.
UIs on the phone is like it's so much easier than it is on the web because on the web you have to plan for mobile. On the mobile, it's like you don't have to plan for some big screen. Like you've got
That's right.
one
Yeah.
UI,
Hmm.
and that's like I mean,
That's
there's
right.
different size screens, but like
Yeah.
it just is, and it's so much more solid feeling than
Yeah.
I don't know how to like describe that any other way than
Hmm.
solid, but like when you have something that's working on an app and it's not a
Hmm.
web page, somehow it just feels more solid.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
Well, one thing I'll say also on the subject of like, differences between web and mobile. And this was a challenge that where I felt we had to, I'm obviously inspired a lot by HTMX and just HTML, but there are kind of fundamental differences between how a web app or web pages work in a browser versus how a mobile app works. And the biggest one for me is navigation and kind of like the concept there, right? Like at its most basic in a web browser, you just have a page, and let's say you click a link, the page you are on is sort of gone, right? It's destroyed. The new page is loaded, and you see the new URL and the address bar.
Yeah,
So conceptually, of course, you can have multiple tabs open with different things, but at its most basic fundamental level, you're only ever looking at one page, and like all the context is there. But in a mobile app, you have like a much more sophisticated and customized navigation hierarchy, right? So when you tap a button in a mobile app, likely another screen is kind of sliding over that other one, right? It's sort of like a new context, a new screen. The
yeah.
other screen is still there, right? And
They
it's
stack
still,
it basically, right?
yeah, they stack, right? And you can see if you sort of use your thumb to like navigate back, you can see both screens at the same time, right? Then there's a difference between, well, when do I show a stack versus I open a new modal, right? Which is kind of a new context where I've opened a modal. Now in this modal, I can have a separate stack, right? So I can go back and forward in that stack, or I can dismiss the modal to close all of those screens. But again, like you can get into a situation where all those screens are in memory. Then there's tabs, right? Which is, I'm switching tabs and I'm getting like a whole different context of stacks and modals there. So
Right.
whereas in the web browser, you basically just press a link, it's going to reload in that page. We needed to get a little more sophisticated and nuanced in how we define the navigation, and then how when someone interacts with an element, yeah, what are we doing? Are we pushing a new screen on the stack? Are we opening a new modal? Is something else happening? So that was one place where I think, yeah, going with our own syntax, not just trying to like reuse HTMLs and web views, gave us the ability to create something that, to your point, feels more solid. It feels more like a mobile app should, because it's embracing those paradigms versus trying to shove just a web page into a mobile app wrapper.
Yeah, and then this is like has been sort of my guiding principle on this also. Like I don't want it to feel like a web page put into,
Hmm.
it's just I've used plenty of those and you can tell, and there's there's something about
Yeah.
it that is just not quite right. And
Hmm.
when you have that kind of and you like you said embrace it, and you embrace the navigation and the swiping of stuff, like if you want to
Yeah.
edit
Hmm.
something you can like have a swipeable hidden
Hmm.
stuff, and the way the modals work, it's like using these tapping into these native things. There's just
Yeah. Hmm.
it's great. Like it's as a web developer who spent all this time fighting with this stuff on the web for so long,
Yeah. Hmm.
seeing one of your apps, seeing one of your sites or your ideas uh, sort of come to life in a real like
Hmm.
mobile app. I mean, it's
Yeah.
awesome.
Hmm.
you know.
You just mentioned the swipeable thing, so I'll just do a quick plug for the Hypermedia Systems book. In it, there's a couple of chapters that I wrote. So the first one introduces sort of this concept of Hyperview, the format, and a little bit about the client. And
Yep.
then the second chapter goes through and re-implements the contact app that in the earlier chapters Carson described, built using HTMX. And then in the third chapter, I say, okay, we just kind of did a straight port of this contact app to mobile, but it doesn't feel, like it's mobile first because it's still essentially like tapping things, right? And so
Yeah.
then I get into, okay, let's extend the client and bring mobile capabilities to it. And swiping is actually one of the examples. So there's a list of contacts. How can I kind of like swipe on it? Oh yeah, this is out of
Sorry,
frame, but
I
I have
wanted to
my
make sure
versions
this
too.
was I use this underneath my computer at all times. Nice. Just to make sure the
Yeah.
plug. Anyway, I am listening. So that yeah, so you got the swipeable
So,
as a primary
conceptually, if
example.
you're thinking about just like declarative, like let's say, in HTMX, oh, I want to do a swipeable thing for mobile web. Well, you have to start thinking, oh, I'm going to have to like do all this JavaScript stuff and, it's going to get complex and, my beautiful declarative HTML is going to start to look a little bit messier, right? So in the book, in that chapter where we talk about swipe, I basically show how I would design starting with the XML to represent something that's swipeable and like maybe the actions that get
Yeah.
revealed, how would those be represented? And then how do you create the custom component in React Native, but hook into like, all the like behaviors and interactions to support it in a way that is very extensible. It's not tied to any specific feature. So you can reuse it across the app or, have this as a community thing. So I'm glad you brought that up because I do think, yeah, swiping to reveal actions is, yeah, like something that people expect on mobile. We don't put it in the core because again, it might be like a little too sophisticated for that, but I think it is very easy and kind of shows the power of the extensibility in Hyperview.
Yeah. So I mean, like I said, when I've read the Hypermedia Systems book, but the Hyperview stuff, I feel like at the time I didn't have the context in my head of like,
Mm.
okay, what is this? So now it's like I'll be able to read this with a totally different mindset. Also, I'm like, like I said, I don't want to be too influenced by it until I've kind of worked through the problem myself also,
Mm.
because I think,
Yeah.
my approach to some of these issues of like, oh yeah, how do you, it sounds just similar where you're thinking from the XML first. Like, how do you model the data in a purely like conceptual way? What's the ideal conceptual way to model this data? A swipeable feature or
Yeah. Hmm.
something like that. And I just think that's this UI can be thought of hierarchical and with
Mm.
attributes and with variations and all this kind of stuff. And so starting there, starting with the API, it just seems so smart.
Yeah.
I mean that's really kind of just, and then from there, hopefully the way that you implement it in React Native or whatever, Flutter or whatever, it's like that will feed from it. But it's like if you have
Mm.
that API correct, that just is a huge benefit.
Yeah. So pretty much anytime, I'll give you an example. If someone wants to check out some of the discussions on our GitHub repository, there's one that I think has been kind of the most challenging and interesting for me is client-side form validation, right? So this has been
Yep.
typically, something that the kind of SPA, React JS kind of systems, they're quite good at this, right? Because they have um, model of the data and they can kind of define whatever logic they want to happen as you're like typing into an input field, right? And they can do kind of client side validation. Really, if you're using HTMX hypermedia, the default is to say, well, send it to the server, let the server validate, kind of replace the form in line so you can see those errors. And you know we do that, and of course that's good, but there are cases where getting kind of more as you type validation is just a better experience for users, right? And I think in the book, I think Carson talks about some ways to do that. Um, with Hyperview, we kind of are running into the same issue. We think, yeah, it would be great, but how do we sort of stick with XML and be able to declare validations in a way that is very declarative, start with the XML. How do we think about defining these things here without having to like build any logic into the app? And again, how to make it extensible. So we're very close to, I think, shipping something, but you can see the conversation was
Interesting.
going on for a long time. We were looking at like, okay, what syntax makes sense? Do this? How is this extensible? Uh, what are other people in the community doing? Let's make sure that that's kind of fits in with this model. So to me, that's been one of the features that has been, yeah, the most interesting to work on. And starting kind of first with the XML, what we want to, what we want to be able to express with it, and then working backwards to how to implement it. There was, yeah, was very interesting.
Yeah, I'll see if I can if I can find that, or if you can send me that the
Sure,
link to
yeah.
that GitHub issue, because I think I'll put that right in the notes on this. Um, yeah, so I guess like in the big picture, if somebody was like listening to this and they've been thinking about maybe building a mobile app, or
Hmm.
like and the thing I what I've been calling them, these sort of apps that I've been building along, it's like you have a web app. I've been calling these companion apps because I don't necessarily want to put my whole web app into, depending on what your business is. Some of it's all going to be mobile first, but my stuff is web first. That's the thing that people sit down, they do their work, but I want them to have a phone with some additional info. So I've been calling companion apps. But if someone wanted to, create a mobile app, like, can you describe the process from starting with nothing, that they go to the hyperview.org site,
Yeah,
and so what's the whole process look like from like zero to having an app on in the app
sure.
store?
So yeah, and I wish this part can be simplified, but what I would tell people now is, yeah, go to our website, download the Hyperview repo. That repo contains kind of the core library, but it also contains a demo app that showcases pretty much every feature available and the community contributed
Nice.
components. That
That's
demo
cool.
app is built using a kind of a framework in the React Native community called Expo. And the way to think about Expo is that, they're trying to, yeah, simplify the process of getting started with React Native. So rather than us developing our own system, just kind of trying to piggyback off of what Expo is doing.
Yep.
So, so you have an Expo app, which has a lot of niceties in terms of packaging the dependencies and having a command line for building the apps to release for iOS and Android. So if you download our demo app, you could start, all you could do is like change that entry point URL, point it to your server, and then follow the Expo instructions to build iOS and Android. That's kind of the minimal amount of work you would have to do. Starting with our demo app, which is already configured with some React Native stuff, then using Expo to do the release process. So, there's like a little bit of a hiccup there that you have to start with Hyperview and then transition to like the Expo docs and follow their docs to figure out how to publish. And of course, their docs will also cover, well, if your intention is to distribute through the stores, you'll also have to like, kind of sign up for the Google Play Store, for the iOS App Store, become a developer, jump through some hoops
Yeah,
there.
yeah. That's
So that's like the
unavoidable.
one-time
I'll
thing.
throw that
Yeah,
in
that's
there.
the
Like,
one-time thing. Yeah.
yeah, I've done that before, and
Hmm.
you have to keep up with it. Pay $99 a
Yeah.
year to be an
Hmm.
iOS developer. You have to create
Yeah.
your app in iOS first, and then you can get a. Actually, I don't know if that. I assume that's
Yeah.
true for this too, but you get a bundle ID, and then you can bring that into your project, and only then will it
That's
sort
right.
of
And then
compile for the
Expo, I
phone.
think, can help, once you have these IDs and things like that. So, I wish the upfront story was a little bit simpler, the way like you can just drop in the HTML script tag and get started. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, there's going to be some upfront costs to actually get the app into the hands of users. But I
Well,
think
a lot of it is
once
not
that's
your
done,
fault.
yeah, 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 we can't really avoid that. I think we could probably improve our documentation though on how to make that work. In the
Gotcha.
book, of
Yeah.
course, I tend to focus on like the cool parts and the unique things, and maybe downplay the release process a little bit. But I think that the good thing is like once you do get that app out there, and it has that entry point URL, then you can really do a lot just server side, just by
Yeah.
updating your backend server that URL points to. You can new screens, you can completely adjust your styling. You can change those interactions. Then you only would have to update the app and release a new app through the stores if you're adding some of these custom components in React Native. But if you're not doing that, you can, release and iterate on your app as much as you want.
Right. Using just the XML and not even sort of,
Exactly. Yep.
yeah. No, I mean that's the beauty of it. That's the dream. And it is a lot of work to get that first app up in the store and to figure out the
Hmm.
bundle stuff and all these other things. And I haven't done any of the what was it called? X shoot the system
So,
to no, not Xcode,
Expo.
but I
Yeah.
mean that you have to do
Expo.
that too. But
Yeah.
yeah, getting the demo app up and running on that's probably involves installing Node and sort of is that like a Node based with package like you use npm to kind of
That's
bring in
right.
the
Yeah.
yeah
Yeah.
okay
So in the demo app, yeah, there's just, some instructions. Yeah. You would use, npm to kind of download the dependencies, and then there's some command lines to run to start everything. So if you just want to
yeah
develop locally, you don't have to do all the stuff we talked about. You just have to either
right
have an Android emulator or iOS simulator locally, and then using the expo commands, you'll be up and running and iterating pretty quickly.
nice and that's all for the most part a one-time thing you
That's right.
get
Yeah.
that in
Mhm.
place and then you've got your sort of hyperview stuff there and then you can build as many apps
Exactly.
as you want
Hmm.
from there once you have that sort of development environment set up. Sound right?
Yeah, that's right. Hmm.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I mean, let me think. Is there anything you feel like that we didn't sort of touch on for, anything you want to sort of mention with Hyperview in general? Do you think people would be interested to hear?
Um, So one thing, yeah, so I think a lot of the listeners are probably, pretty familiar with HTMX. So I will say, like HTMX and Intercooler were a big inspiration for the ways to do interactions. So I think a lot of our conversation so far has been
Right.
about the
Actually, that's
UI. We haven't talked as much about, well, what happens when I press this thing, right? So a lot of the
yeah.
ideas from Intercooler and HTMX around, well, I'm getting a fragment of HTML. Do I append it? Do I swap it somewhere else? All of that is built into the syntax in Hyperview. So, um, you know, all of that is kind of possible and sort of native. It's not like a separate library like HTMX has to be on top of HTML. In Hyperview, these are sort of first class concepts.
So
And
you have like, are you
mhm,
giving things IDs and you have targets and you have sort of, different types of triggers and that sort of same,
exactly. Yep.
same
So all of
mentality?
that would feel very familiar. Um, yeah, all of that is there. So one thing that actually
Nice.
in the lecture I gave, Carson pointed this out. So initially, because I was just taking inspiration from them, uh, we were doing the same thing in Hyperview where you would just add extra attributes to the elements that you want to make interactable. But
Right.
then I realized like, well, that's just kind of a limitation in HTML because you can't easily define new elements. And it causes some problems. Like, what if when I press this thing, I want multiple stuff to happen? HTMX kind of struggles to express that by just adding attributes. And I
Interesting.
realized in Hyperview, well, let's just create a new element. We're going to call this tag behavior. And we're going to, the behavior tag will be directly nested as a child under the element that we're interacting with. And then we can say, okay, this behavior says, when someone presses on trigger, load this content from this href and swap it here. Well, we can have multiple behaviors now, right? So maybe when I press, I want two different things to happen. Or maybe I want to define that if I press on something, this happens. But if I do a long press, something else happens. So we have this behavior syntax, which was initially inspired by HTMX, but has evolved to be more powerful in that you can have multiple behaviors attached to the same element that can either
Interesting.
have the same trigger or different triggers, and that gives a lot of flexibility. And much like the UI, these behaviors are also extensible by writing some React Native or JavaScript code. So, you could define your own behavior to start a phone call, for example, or to switch to another app, or to, show some kind of push notification. So that's
Wow.
another point of extensibility that we didn't talk about, but I want to mention because I think it's like at the same time, probably familiar to someone who's an HTMX developer, but also I think pushes what a hypermedia based format is capable of expressing in terms of interactions.
Yeah, that's cool because then you can, I mean, besides tapping into all those sort of new triggers and new possibilities
Hmm.
on the phone, also, because I've come across that with using HTMX where it's
Hmm.
not that uncommon that you need two things to happen, you know?
Yeah. Hmm.
And so you figure out workarounds and stuff. I
Yeah.
don't remember what they are right now, but I mean, whether maybe you're sending using like a swap OOB or something to like
Yeah.
send
Yeah.
data back in two places, but like
Hmm.
really what conceptually you just want two things to happen. So I think
That's right.
that's a
Yeah.
really interesting
Hmm.
way to think about it is sort of so you can have like I'm trying to like picture the syntax and like maybe that's too in the weeds, but like you said you define behaviors. So is this an attribute and you just like behavior and then you add an attribute and that behavior name of the attribute has to match
Yeah.
one of the behaviors that you have in similar to a trigger, but you can sort of just do as many as you
Yeah.
want.
So let's say I have a text, right? So in Hyperview, text is an element, right? So it's like, um, open tag for text. Then I say click me, and then I have the close tag for text. So after the open tag for text, you have another tag in there called behavior, and that behavior can have like trigger press, load this href, and append it to some other target ID, right? So it's like nested in that text tag is a behavior tag. And because
Okay.
it's a direct child of the text, it's going to apply to that text. So, the behavior is what's defining that interaction. And you can have as many of those behavior tags in that text element as you want.
Because they're
And
not an
they can have the same
attribute.
trigger, they can have different triggers. Yeah. So that's
Yeah,
essentially
yeah.
it. Hmm.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm trying to think how that would work in HTMX, because but everything is sort of attribute based. You don't
That's right. Yeah.
necessarily have
Hmm.
any sort of tag processing in HTMX. You could like probably hack your way through it and like have a tag with a certain attribute on it would count as a behavior for the parent or something. Like you could do something crazy like that, but
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not exactly set up for it.
That's right. Yeah, and I think it's a little bit of a limitation. I mean, I think the HTML5 spec and browsers are kind of lenient if you want to create your own non-standard tags to do things, but you can get into a little bit of a dicey territory there. Whereas in Hyperview, it's like fully supported. We also have a full schema validation for these things, so you can make sure that you are writing like completely correct XML, including representing these nested behaviors.
Yep. Yep. So how much of your like just percentage wise, like how much of your time is sort of like working on Hyperview versus like working on, company stuff that's completely separate and its own
Mhm.
business? Is it sort of like a big part of your day to day, or is it now that it's built, it's sort of the community has taken over some of it?
Yeah, so we have, we're big enough now at Instawork that we can have like a dedicated team we call our client platform team. And there's a couple of engineers that support both kind of our front ends for web and mobile. And a big part of what they're doing on mobile is supporting the Hyperview library. So
Right.
if you go through the commits, you'll see a lot of contributors who are not me. And most of that is like the great engineers on that team who are taking, they're leading this push to pull things out from our main Instawork apps and putting them into the community. We recently did like a huge redesign of our demo app to better showcase all of the capabilities. They're fixing bugs. We have a bunch of features that we've been working on, like an upgrade to navigation. So, I talked about all the complexities of defining navigation and It gets even more complex if you think about we want to be able to like deep link a user into a certain place that opens the app into like some nested screen.
Oh,
And
interesting.
we had
Yep.
an engineer who kind of completely redesigned and created a XML syntax for defining, okay, here's how the whole navigation structure works, and it lets us kind of, um, lets users customize things a lot more. So yeah, so I
Wow.
think we're doing a lot of work. My day to day is I try to advise and kind of steer the direction and keep the spirit of Hyperview in terms of having a very lean core, making sure it's extensible and addressing comments from and issues that arise on the GitHub repository. And then thinking through some of these bigger fundamental changes, like I mentioned, client side validation, which I hope will be landing um, in a release in the next month or so. So
Nice.
that's kind of where I've been doing. But I think I've found, sort of how you said you learn best by doing and then like extracting from that and like, coming up with your theory of how something works. I think for us, it's also been good to focus on developing the InstaWork apps. And when we run into an issue, like we want to do something in our apps that's not very possible or easy with Hyperview, then we say, okay, we can't do it with what we have now. Can we create an extension to do it, like either a custom component or a custom behavior? If we can, that's great. If we can't, like maybe with client-side validation, then we say, okay, how would we do it in the library? And I think this, development is being led by our own problems and needs. And I think that's helped us come up with solutions that I think a lot of other app developers would encounter just in a practical way versus, being sort of driven purely theoretically by things we think are nice to have.
No, I mean, I think that's really a great model for open source in general, where you're building a tool to scratch your own itch, and
Hmm.
and not only that, there's a monetary, component of it where like there's people who just like toil endlessly on open source projects and they devote their life, a large portion of their life to it. But if it's not directly tied to something that's helping their business or helping their income, it's sort of, I don't want to say doomed, but it has
Yeah.
this like
Hmm.
cloud over it.
Mm.
And so I feel like this model of like you have a successful business, you're building a tool, but like putting that back into the community, like I'm going to build this tool so that it works for us in a great way, but
Yeah.
I'm going to separate it so that I can now open source it. That's actually how Laravel got started. The guy who created
Yeah.
Laravel,
Hmm.
built it first for his company, but he had it
That's
in
right.
mind.
Hmm.
I'm going to use this separately for other
Yeah.
projects, and eventually,
Django as well,
obviously,
right?
Django's the
We're
same
big
way, is
Django
it?
users.
Okay,
Yeah. Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
think
it's
it
it's
started
such a good
to run
model.
like a local newspaper. They were using it to run their like news website and pulled out the framework from there.
Yeah, and it's like you come
Mhm.
across things and it's like you don't just want to fix them because it'll be good for people. Like no, I need this. I need this to work and I need
Yeah.
it to work in a good way. And so it's like
Yeah.
it
Hmm.
really makes it work nicely. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Very cool. All right. Well, so I mean, I think maybe I want to respect your time and I just want to like sort of thank you very much. Like first of all for putting this project out into the world. I think it's super cool and I haven't used it yet because now I'm kind of deep in my own thing, but I think I'll probably continue that and then sort of take a closer look at some of the concepts because it sounds like you've solved so many of the problems that I'm about to encounter doing my own project. So it's going to be super cool
Yes.
to look into those more.
Oh, thanks for having me and shining some more light on the project. Like I definitely think it's cool and I think more people should be using it. So I hope yeah, more people can find out about it. And like I mentioned before, we're pretty active in discussions and issues on GitHub. And also if people just want to learn more, hopefully we can share the link to the lecture at
Yep.
Montana State, and then also the link to the Hypermedia Systems book, which is completely free to read online. So you don't have to buy a copy. You can get all the content there.
Yeah, though the copy is cool.
Yeah,
But yes, it
yeah,
is. You
yeah.
can totally buy everything. It's all free online as well.
Yeah. I realize. Yeah, I should be promoting selling the book.
No, actually, I like the way that's sort of been handled. It's like, if you're the type of person who'd like to just read it online or can, or don't have the money right now, like the information is there. But if it's helped your life, and it's nice to have a physical copy. So then it's
Yeah,
available as that too. So
yeah.
yeah.
We could probably do a whole other podcast about that decision and the process of publishing and self-publishing. Might be fun to talk to Carson about as well.
Yeah, no, I think that would be fascinating. But yeah, so thank you very much for talking today, and I'll include all the as whatever links we can here, and I think so. I'll just like the big picture for me, I think, is like uh, the onboarding. The hardest part right now for Hyperview, when I was looking at it, is probably the onboarding and sort of what you've sort of described from it.
Mhm.
But I mean, I'll just like the plug for the hypermedia way of doing mobile. Like, I've had a small taste of it working on my Flutter project, and like to anyone listening, like Hyperview is obviously much farther along, and is going to have like a lot of stuff, and has active apps out there in the world. People are using them. If you as a web developer get a chance to build an app in this manner, I think you will love it. Like, it's going to be a complete game changer. So anyway, that's my plug for Hyperview also. But,
Thank you. Yeah, and yeah, I totally agree.
well, yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.